Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today's lecture will be Crisis and Transformation, and we'll be looking at the late Middle Ages. We'll be covering the years 1300 to 1450 AD. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain how environmental changes and overpopulation expose structural weakness in Europe's agricultural and demographic systems. Describe the impact of the Black Death on society, religion, labor, and belief in traditional institutions. Analyze how post-plague labor shortages and peasant revolts challenged the foundations of feudal society. Evaluate the Avignon papacy and Great Schism undermined the moral authority and political unity of the church. And finally, trace how the 100 Years' War advanced centralized states and refined the roles of monarchies in Europe. Okay, so let's pick our story up where we last left off. The High Middle Ages. So the High Middle Ages was a time of surface prosperity. Towns were full. Kings were growing confident. The church reigned supreme. Within cities, cathedrals would have towered over teeming markets. Universities would have taught Aristotle and scripture. Trade would have tied cities like London, Cairo, Bruges, and Byzantium. And kings ruled by divine rights, while popes were claiming universality. But underneath this all, hidden pressures were beginning to grow. As the population expanded, people used up most of the good arable land, most of the good farmland. And this began to force people onto marginal farmland. So early on, Europe had been relatively empty, but as it started to fill up, well, the good farmland started to go. There were also other tensions. For instance, urban wealth that was beginning to accumulate in cities was beginning to conflict with feudal and rural traditions. As monarchs had grown, they had taxed, they had borrowed, and they had centralized. And the church was increasingly entangled in politics and was beginning to show cracks. And this ended in the big showdown between Pope Boniface VIII in 1303 and his attack by Philip IV's agents, and had placed the papacy, had placed the Pope, placed the capital of Western Christianity in Avignon, where it was closely watched by the Templars. And so I'm going to circle back to something that we've talked about already, something that is been talked about not only by historians, but a lot of conspiracy theorists like to talk about that, and that's the fall of the Templars. And so we just talked about Philip IV. He's the one that had attacked the Pope, but he had also waged war on one of the crusading orders. You may or may not remember this, but in 1307, Philip was looking for money. And the Knights Templar, this crusading order, had quite a bit of it. You may remember that during the Crusades, they had kind of been the bankers. They had carried money for people, and they were pretty wealthy as a result. And so, according to legend, Jacques de Molay, one of the Templars, I believe is the leader of the Templars, the Grand Master of the Templars. Well, he was one of the people who hadn't admitted to some of the allegations that Philip was making. He was making really harsh allegations against the Templars, and he agreed to go to the stake rather than admit that Philip was correct about him. And so contemporary accounts claim that as the flames were rising around the defiant Templars, de Molay called on God to judge his persecutors. And he said, quote, "Pope Clement, King Philip, before a year has passed, I summon you to the tribunal of God." Now, later legend sharpened this into a curse, summoning the Pope and the King to die within the year. And that's what happened. Both Pope and King both died in that year. And for many, as they look back in the 14th century, many people look back to this incident as a bit of a turning point. Because it happened in 1307 at the very beginning of that century, and it seemed to usher in a cursed century. The 14th century would see the climate cool and harvests begin to fail, and a weakened population succumb to famine. Plague would sweep across Europe and devastate its populations. The turmoil caused by this would see labor revolts and peasant uprisings against nobles. It would also usher in a century where two of Western Europe's greatest powers, England and France, were locked in what became 100 Years' War. And it would also see the church split as rival popes assumed the papal tiara, excommunicating each other and turning Europe into chaotic situations. And so this was going to be a century where crops would fail, bodies would fall, peasants would rise, popes would flee, and kings would fight. So let's look at how this emerges. And we'll start with the greatest tragedy, and that's the plague. But it's important to understand that long before the plague had come, the climate had begun to turn. Now, I mentioned that the Middle Ages was an unusually warm period of time. The High Middle Ages, anyways. Not so much the Dark Ages. But the next couple of centuries, from the 14th to the 19th, was known as the Little Ice Age. Okay? In around 1300, temperatures began to cool. The weather became wetter, and this began to shorten the crop growing season. Crops began to fail. Glaciers advanced from the north. Rivers flooded, and winters became more brutal. And even a small shift like this would begin to stretch the food supply, especially in the Middle Ages. And so this ushered in what became known as the Great Famine. And the Great Famine lasted from about 1315 to 1317, and it was a direct result of some of these harsh climatic conditions. Now remember, the population of Europe was already much larger than it had ever been, and many people were farming marginal land by this point. And when torrential rains ruined 3 straight harvests, grain prices soared. Peasants couldn't afford food. Starvation quickly came, It was followed by disease and lawlessness. And the famine began to reveal just how fragile society had become. And so this put a strain on the population. Starving peasants um, became subject to malnutrition, and this began to stunt people's growth. It weakened their immunity, it lowered fertility rates. And so populations had begun to decline across Europe even before the plague came. But certainly starving people and poor diets would leave Europe very vulnerable to any future pandemic. And so as hunger was gnawing away at people's body, something worse began to creep in on the ships. Death, invisible and unstoppable. And so let us talk now about the great tragedy, the Black Death. As crops failed and prices soared, death would now begin to stalk the land. The death and the plague, began to arrived in Europe in the Italian port city of Messina, which is right in between Sicily and Italy. It's on the Sicilian side. And this was the first landfall that we know of in Western Europe, and that came in 1347 as Genoese ships pulled into port. Once in Western Europe, the plague spread very rapidly through a weakened and also more urbanized Europe. It spread to the rest of Italy, into France, into Spain, and from there into the north and into the east. Now it's estimated that about 30 to 50% of the European population died in this plague. And the plague struck across all strata of society. It struck rich, it struck poor, it struck rural, it struck cities. It seemed to strike indiscriminately. People who contracted the plague reported feeling a high fever, painful swellings called buboes, usually in their groin, armpits, and neck, and then a rapid blackening of the skin from internal bleeding. Usually, death came rapidly off after that, and people were often dead within days. The suffering before death was often very visible, very terrifying, and very fast. And the science of the time couldn't explain what was happening. The causes weren't understood. Some people blamed bad air. Others said it was divine wrath. Some said it was due to planetary alignment. And yet others claimed it was a conspiracy to kill them. And so the speed, the scale, and just the horror of the whole thing destroyed trust in society and in the social order itself. It's really hard to imagine. We'd have to put ourselves in the place of the sheer terror people must have experienced as 30 to 50% of people died. You didn't know when you were going to be next. The suffering would have been miserable. And this really, really had an impact on people's psyche. The plague didn't spare the religious. Priests often died while giving last rites. Still others fled instead of doing their duties. Because of fear of contraction, many people couldn't get the sacraments, leaving them even more fearful and more terrified. Families were broken up as people would abandon their own loved ones or leave family members unburied for fear of contracting the disease. Oftentimes, when people were buried, the number of bodies was so great that people were buried in mass graves. And still others turned on their neighbors and began scapegoating. And this was particularly true of the Jews. Rumors began to spread that the Jews had poisoned the well as part of a conspiracy to destroy their Christian neighbors. When, of course, nothing could have been further from the truth, because Jews often died in greater numbers, since they were often crowded into ghettos. Others tried to turn God's wrath away. Groups like the Flagellants. These were parades of pious people who tried to turn God's wrath away by whipping themselves as they went through the streets in parade, often attracting large crowds as people prayed that this would somehow stop the plague. Others, instead of turning more pious, became less so. Many people took the attitude that we're going to die anyways, so let us enjoy while we can. And so they turned to hedonism. And so death began to fracture medieval society as fear and fervor deepened. Now, one of the biggest impacts were demographic. We can see here a map of the population of medieval England, and you can see that it dropped from a medieval high of about 5 million down to about 2.5 million, a 50% decline. And so we can imagine that with impacts like these, it couldn't help but impact the economy. One of the effects of the plague was that it killed so many serfs and peasants that those who survived found themselves in a desirable condition. There was such demand for labor, and there were so few laborers that many serfs were able to barter for their freedom. And many of those who were already free were able to demand higher wages and get better terms. And so, though landowners resisted, one of the impacts of the Black Death was the decline of serfdom and a general rise in the prosperity of the laboring classes. Think about it. If you survived, there was now a lot of good land around instead of the shortage that had previously existed. And so the plague was going to not only reshape people's bodies, their beliefs, but it was also going to shape the economy. Well, when the dying began to stop in the 1350s, the survivors began to pick up their tools and oftentimes found themselves in conflict with the ruling classes. And so economic tensions began to rise. So labor shortages, as I said, empowered the peasants after the Black Death. Many of these people were able to demand and get higher wages and better conditions in general, but many lords resented this. And since it was lords who had the ear of the king, or who were the justice themselves, or sat on some sort of governing body. Many of them tried to implement wage freezes. In other words, they tried to bring the wages back down to the wages of 1347. But obviously things had changed a lot. Many of these lords also tried to impose new taxes to make up for their losses. Or some of them even tried to reassert their feudal rights. And so this led to tensions and a buildup between the elites. Many peasants who had just suffered loss resented this honestly. And government, strapped for cash now that there were less taxpayers, tried to recoup their losses. And so this led to uprisings everywhere across Europe. In France, these were called jacqueries. And they began in France in 1358 as rural peasants revolted against their taxes and against the rapacious nature of the nobility. In 1381, the English peasants revolted. Once again, the issue was the government demanding high taxes and the corrupt royal officials that they perceived to be behind them. Now, in all cases, these revolts were met with suppression and fear. And so oftentimes these revolts would be put down very, very harshly. Those involved, and oftentimes even those not involved, would be killed and tortured in the worst way. And so, after, millions die as a result of plague, thousands and thousands of more peasants would have died from just the brutal beatdown from the ruling classes. But these revolts did have an effect that they began to shake the confidence of the elites and showed that peasants wouldn't always remain passive. And so, as a result of the tumult of mid-century, the idea of protection for service, this model that had underlied feudalism, began to break down. The notion that somehow your lord was there to protect you had been proved to be a farce. The notion that peasants would be compliant was also shown to not be the reality either. And so feudal dues and feudal requirements began to erode. And they would never come back, not in the same force as they would. And so as this was going on across Europe, as there was feudal revolt, there was also problems in the other estate, in the church. The church was in a state of crisis as well, to make matters worse. Now, in a previous lecture, we had talked about the papacy relocating to Avignon. And this occurred in 1309. All right. This occurred after Philip IV had sent his agents down to rough up the Pope. Under French influence, the papacy moved not into France per se, although it would be in modern-day France, but right to the borders of France. And it would stay there for until 1377. So for about 70 years, the papacy was on the French border. And while in France, the church began to lose control over its lands in central Italy. Right? As long as the Pope was in central Italy, it could control what are called the Papal States. I'm not sure if we've talked about the Papal States, but this is the part of central Italy that was directly controlled by the church. It was kind of almost like a fief. It was almost like the Pope's personal property during the Middle Ages, and so he would support himself from those lands. But without those lands, well, without the Pope there, those lands began to slip away. They weren't paying their taxes. They were acting more independently. And so the church had to find other ways to make money. And so what they began to do was they began to essentially tax people. They increased the fees. They would, if you wanted to get baptized, it would be a fee. You want to get married, it's a fee. If you want the priest to come say prayer for your dying uncle, it's a fee. The papal bureaucracy became much, much more organized. The papal court also grew very rich and very lavish. And so critics began to complain. First of all, the fact that the papacy wasn't in Rome was shocking to a lot of people. But the worldliness, the way that the church was acting, especially in a century of crisis, drew a lot of raised eyebrows. And so the famous Italian poet Petrarch referred to this as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Just like the ancient Jews had been taken from the holy city of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, many contemporaries saw the church in Babylon, in Avignon, a tool of the French Pope. And so this really began to undermine the Pope's authority. He was supposed to be the leader of all Christians, but the fact that he was kind of a puppet of the Pope made people wonder. And so multiple popes began to promise that they were going to move the papacy back to Rome. But instead of solving the problem, when Urban VI was elected in 1378, multiple French cardinals claimed that they had only elected him because they had been pressured by the Roman mob. And so those cardinals went back to Avignon and elected another individual as pope. And so now, rather than solving the problem, you had two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. And depending on what your politics were and the geopolitical considerations, different countries backed different popes. Naturally, France backed the Avignon popes, whereas England, who was then at war with France, backed the Roman pope. And you can see the map here of just how confusing things got. In an attempt to solve the problem, a council was called, and they disbarred both popes and elected a third pope. Did that solve the problem? No, because the other two popes didn't step down, and now instead of having two popes, you had three popes. One in Rome, one in Avignon, and one walking around Europe looking for a home. And so all of Europe was split on these important questions. And then again, this is a Europe that's at war. This is a Europe that's suffering from plague. And for the common people, this caused a big crisis of faith. Because, quite frankly, quite naturally, both popes didn't like each other. And so not only did they excommunicate each other, but they excommunicated all the bishops that followed the other guy, and by implication, everybody else who followed the other guy. And so you couldn't really be sure if you were following the right pope. And so this caused all kinds of consternation among the faithful. Well, the papacy was finally united in the 15th century. The council was finally called, and the Council of Constance in 1414 to 1418, they deposed all the rival popes and they elected Martin V, who finally restored unity. And so, after years of exile and schism, the church had reemerged, but it had reemerged bruised and diminished. Popes were no longer held in quite the same esteem that they once had been, especially during the Middle Ages. And it seemed that many of these popes were involved in politics. They turned to wealth, they turned to gamesmanship and spectacle to rebuild their authority. I mean, one positive thing that did come out of this was that many of these folks, in order to increase their prestige, were supporting artists. And so this was one of the major sources of revenue for the Renaissance, which was emerging at this point in Europe. And they were also great patrons of architects and learning. But it did very little to assure people of their spiritual worthiness. And so the issues of corruption were never dealt with. The issues of what were perceived as the church selling offices, its violence. And for the time being, the church could ignore the calls for reform, but the seeds of revolt against the Catholic Church were being sown, which is, if you ever take a Reformation course or a second part of this course, you may look at the Protestant Reformation, but that will be a century in the future. Finally, I want to talk about war, because aside from famine, plague, peasant revolt, and spiritual crisis, yes, the 14th century had its share of war, particularly the 100 Years' War. And so the 100 Years' War was a battle between England and between France. It broke out in 1337 after the French King Charles IV had died without an heir. The English king claimed that he had a better title since he had intermarried, his ancestors had intermarried with the French. The French had a rival in mind, Philip VI. And so this was going to lead to a dynastic struggle. Who had the better claim to be the French king? Well, observers at the time assumed that as the biggest and most powerful country in Europe, that the French would mop the floor with the English. But the English introduced some new technology, the longbow. Traditionally, throughout the Middle Ages, battles had been between mounted knights. They were undefeated on the battlefield. To even be considered a knight, you had to have wealth and nobility, and it was an upper class affair. But what the English did is they realized that their peasants, armed with longbows, were capable of piercing armor. And so the French lined up to fight in a traditional way, and the English longbowmen were able to mow them down. And because of the rules of chivalry, well, the French kept fighting this stupid way. It clearly wasn't working. Charging into a bunch of guys who are located up on a hill, who are heavily defended with with bows and arrows is a stupid idea, but the French knights were so invested in this idea of chivalry that, peasants with longbows could never defeat them, that they suffered some pretty brutal beatdowns, particularly at the Battle of Crécy and then at the Battle of Poitiers. And what these proved to everybody was that the chivalric method of warfare was coming to a close. As always in war, it's the common people that suffer. And so you can imagine 100 Years' War where you have two rival armies, and one of them is foreign, the other one is led by nobles, that they're not going to be particularly sensitive to the needs of the common folk. And so this was a war where peasants suffered. Farms and towns and feudal estates were devastated by campaigners. And the demands of war really forced states to come up with more money in order to prosecute this war, something, medieval kings had been starting to do. But this war really moved that into high gear. And so one of the things that this war was going to do was not only was it going to force kings, both kings, to look for new sources of taxation. This was definitely a factor in both peasant revolts that we talked about earlier. Very expensive to fight these wars. But increasingly, what it was going to lead to was a professionalization of the army. All right. I mean, battlefield knights had already shown themselves to be ineffective. And the English were pioneering the way with the longbows. But on both sides, standing armies began to grow. These are professional soldiers, and not just people who are fighting because they swore an oath of loyalty to the king. Another major breakthrough was the advent of gunpowder. Gunpowder had actually begun appearing in the 1250s, but the 100 Years' War was the first war in Europe that really saw it become a factor. Cannons proved to be a game changer. Not only was it relatively, not only were they new, but they were capable of battering down walls, something that had always bedeviled attackers during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was a great time to be a defender, not a good time to be an attacker because of castles. But cannons proved that they were able to easily knock down castle walls. Guns were a big game changer too. You could easily kill a knight with a gun, and they weren't really that expensive. And you didn't need to have someone with a noble pedigree to aim one. And so they really began to change the battlefield. This really was a time of growth where the state power is going to grow, taxation is going to become more sophisticated, armies are going to start to grow. We really are groping toward modernity here. And so these are like physical, material things, but culturally too, these wars had a pretty big impact. One of the things that scholars really begin to note is the idea of nationhood. And this is a complicated idea, and so I don't want to belabor the point too much, but suffice it to say that in the Middle Ages, very few people thought of themselves as English or French or Spanish or anything else, really. Mostly people identified with their locality, their village, their town perhaps. Maybe if they were in a religious order, they would identify themselves as an Augustinian monk or something like that. But the 100 Years' War marked a turning point. And what we start to see, both in England and France, and elsewhere for that matter, but particularly here, is the idea of being French or being English. And so figures like Joan of Arc, um, who was the young peasant girl that united the French people, became a symbol of the nation. Um, uh, the flag of England, the St. George flag, began to become a symbol of Englishness. And so we start to see the idea of national symbols beginning to take form, the idea of modern nationality. And after centuries of linguistic fragmentation, this also begins a period where languages were beginning to consolidate as the dialects around London and around Paris start to become the standardized languages. And so we start to really get this idea. And so the roots of modern political identity in many ways are born out of these conflicts. Okay, I want to end with another profile. Last time we looked at a Florentine at the beginning, who was living at the very beginning of the period we looked at today. Today I want to look at a guy who had been at the end, and that is Cosimo de' Medici. And in 1429, young Cosimo inherited his family's bank. It wasn't a particularly important bank, especially not by Florentine standards, but it's important to recognize him. He's a man who would have no title. The Medicis weren't royalty. He didn't have a castle. He only had a ledger book where he would track debts. And under his watch, the Medicis would become the financiers of not only the popes, but also many kings in many cities. And so Cosimo is a bit of a bridge figure. His father had survived. He had survived the plague. His father had died of plague. And Cosimo was born into this like really fractured world. He'd lived at a time where famine had still left its scars. Plague had emptied out homes. Peasants had revolted. Popes were fleeing from Rome. War had drained blood and treasure. Manors, monasteries, and churches had lost their appeal as people lost confidence in the church. And so the early parts of his life had been part of this terrible century. But Cosimo and the Medici family in general and his city in Florence was about to usher in a wonderful age. Because it would be in Florence, and particularly under Cosimo's with the help of his money, that the Florentine Renaissance would begin. Because what Cosimo would do is he would not only be a great banker, but he was also going to be a great patron of the arts. And so in the 15th century, many of these cities are going to recover, particularly places like Florence. Wealth, like the wealth of the Medicis, is going to become even more important. The faltering faith from the disasters of the previous century left room for new ideas to come in as people began to look back to the classics, back to the Greeks and Romans for inspiration. The century would see these kings who had already begun to develop these institutions and these armies get more powerful. Popes, now back in Rome, would become great patrons of the arts. And it would be Cosimo's bank that would fund not only trade, but libraries, cathedrals, academies, and artists. It would be under Cosimo that figures like Michelangelo, um, figures like Donatello, figures like Leonardo um, would first get their start. And so the 14th century had been a time of ruin and fracture. The 15th century was going to be an era of imagination and something new. It was going to be the beginning of the Renaissance.